So here we are really getting into macroeconomics, and the first thing we need to do is get some idea of measuring things. We want to measure the whole economy. We want to measure what's going on. We want to see some numbers. So we're going to start with this thing called gross domestic product, which not only is going to give us numbers, but it's also going to give us an idea of kind of how things are, how things work. So we're going to start with something called the circular flow. The flow idea means income. Income flows. When someone asks you what your income, your answer is always, oh, I make $10 an hour, I make $100,000 a year, I make $1 million a century. It's always got a time element to it, a flow. So we start out and we say that households up here, these households, which are economic units that are out there buying stuff, they don't sell stuff, they don't make stuff, they just buy stuff. They have income, and they can do 4 things with their income. Number 1, they can spend it. We don't say spend, we say consume. The economist's word for spending is consumption. We're going to use that up. We're going to consume it. So we're going to buy stuff. And this particular consumption right here means buying things that are made in our own country. It's domestic consumption. It's consumption of, in our case, U.S.-made stuff. Then there's something called savings. Savings is just income that is not consumed. That's the definition of savings. When you buy a share of stock, you're not investing, you're saving. It just sounds better to say investing. You're actually saving. Number 3, you can pay your taxes. And number 4, you can consume things that are made in other countries, what obviously we call imports. And that money is going to actually leave the country. So now we can make this look really horrible by adding a whole bunch of stuff. This thing together is the circular flow of income. If you really want to understand this, you need to think about the Lion King. The antelope eats the grass. The lion eats the antelope. The lion dies, fertilizes the grass. As long as the grass is growing, the antelopes are eating the grass, the lions are eating the antelopes, and the lions are dying and fertilizing the grass. The pride lands are beautiful. Everything works just fine. So in our economy here, we have this funny little economy. The households are going to do those 4 things with their money. When I spend money to buy, when I go to Subway and spend $5 and buy a sandwich, Subway gets that $5 directly. So the money the household spend on consumption go right down here, and there's something missing from the bottom of my screen. That thing that's missing from the bottom of my screen is something that we call businesses. So the business is going to get the consumption. My savings go into a special kind of business called a financial intermediary. Those are banks, insurance companies, stockbrokers, bond brokers, all kinds of businesses whose job it is to take money and pull it together and loan money out. You don't put $1 million in your bank account so that it can be borrowed. 1 million people put $1 in their bank account so somebody can borrow it. These financial intermediaries bring together lots of small bits of money and turn them into large bits of money to make a loan. So businesses buy capital. Businesses build factories. They build machines. They do exciting capital formation kind of stuff. We call that investment. Investment is the purchase of capital. Savings is supposed to get turned into investment. It doesn't always, and we'll come back and talk about that lots. Not today, though. Your taxes, the government just takes them and spend them. Imports don't get turned into exports. The import money is actually going to leave the country, and the export money is going to come in. All that money then gets paid out to the world and it comes back, right? You give your money to the business takes that money that it used, it buys raw materials, it pays its workers, we pay for investment, the government's spending money on stuff, generating money through exports, and that money flows back around to the household and it starts over. So your income goes down, back around, goes to the household, it's consumed and saved, and we pay our taxes, and the government spends it, and there's investment, and that businesses are out there paying their workers from the consumption that you make, and then around that money comes again. Okay? Over and over and over again, we're going to go around this flow. So that circular flow represents gross domestic product, which is the basic measure of our income. GDP measures expenditure in the economy, total expenditure, and it measures total production, which at equilibrium should be the same thing. We should be spending what we produce. Where's the spending? Well, it's in consumption and savings and taxes, C plus S plus T. So if we go back, you see C, S, and T. We want imports and exports grouped together, so we're going to do a little algebra and move the imports down here. When we move it down there, it'll turn from a positive into a negative. So we're going to have C plus S plus T. This imports goes away, it comes down here, and we have C and I and G and X, exports minus imports. So again, if we look from that circular flow, we have C plus S plus T, consumption plus savings plus taxes, and we have consumption, investment, government, exports minus imports, right? It's this, C and S and T. Bring the imports down, but convert it from a plus into a minus. When you do that, CIG, exports minus imports. Okay, beautiful. Now, definition of gross domestic product. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a given year. What's that mean? Start with market value. Everything in GDP has to have come through a market. What that means is it's got to be legal, it's got to have a price. If you trade a jet ski for a car, doesn't go to GDP, not market value. If somebody's doing something illegal, didn't go through a traditional market, not market value. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we calculate a lot of these things from income tax returns. And drug cartels are generally not filing their income tax returns. So we don't know all of what goes on. We're stuck with what we've got. The only exception to that, there's a couple of them actually, but the major two are farmers who grow their own food. Used to be that most of us were farmers and grew our own food, and that was a big part of GDP, so we added that in. Even though it's a small part of GDP now, for consistency's sake, we still add in the food that farmers grow for their own use. And then we add in a measure of housing services. Your house doesn't just help you 1 year. You buy your house and you live in it for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, or somebody does. And so we add into GDP a representation of that market value of services you get from your house over time. Okay. Final. Final means we count everything in its final form. And this is related to this idea of a given year. If you buy an 85 Chevy at the used car dealer, that's not going to count in GDP because it was built in 85. We want to count everything exactly one time. Exactly one time. So we do that by looking at everything only in its final form. There's a technical way we do this, which is called value added. Don't worry about that. Just think about the fact that we look at everything in its final form. So if we build a car, we get iron ore out of the ground, we turn it into steel, we turn the steel into a car bumper, put the car bumper on a car. We only count the car because the bumper's in it and the steel's in it and the iron ore's in it. So everything in its final form. Where this gets complex is, say, the bumper gets built in 2018, but it doesn't get put into the car until 2019. In 2018, that bumper is in its final form, so we're going to count the bumper in 2018, and then when we count the car in 2019, we're going to take the bumper out of it. So everything gets counted one time. Only things that go through the market in their final form in the year that they are produced. Okay, we have two other forms of GDP. One is called per capita GDP. That's GDP per person. We take GDP, we divide it by the population, and that's per capita GDP. Real GDP, you've probably been hearing about people telling you to keep it real. You didn't know what that meant. What it means is adjusted for inflation, adjusted for rising prices. If we made 20 million cars this year and we made 20 million cars last year, but we sold them for more money this year, we raised the price, GDP is going to go up, even though we made the same number of cars. Real GDP isn't going to go up. Nominal GDP, which is the money GDP, is going to go up. It's going to say, look, you sold those cars for more money. There's more money involved. Real GDP is going to say, no, 2017 and 2018 were the same because 20 million cars are 20 million cars. Okay? There's two basic ways to calculate GDP. The traditional way, which is what I've been talking about, where things aren't anyway adjusted for differences between countries. By that measure, the United States by far has the largest GDP in the world. There's a second way of measuring GDP, which is called purchasing power parity, and that adjusts for the fact that, a house is cheaper in India than it is in the U.S. Food is cheaper in many countries in the world than it is in the U.S. So to say that, just like real GDP, we want to adjust for the inflation in our own country. If we adjust for the differences in pricing, we get what's called purchasing power parity GDP. And if we do that, China's number 1, U.S. is 2, and India's 3. Where if we don't adjust for purchasing power parity, U.S. is 1, China's 2, and Japan is 3. Okay, so GDP does not just go up over time. It goes generally up over time, but there's an up and down. The up and down of GDP is called the business cycle. The GDP goes up, it hits what we call a peak, and this is real GDP we're talking about here, not regular GDP. Hits a peak, then it goes down. That down is called a contraction. It might or might not be a recession. When GDP goes down, it's called a contraction. We hit a bottom point, that's called the trough, and then GDP goes up, and that's called an expansion. Some people call the first part of the expansion the recovery. I don't care if you do that or not. You can say recovery. You cannot say recovery. Peak, contraction, trough, expansion. The GDP, real GDP goes through that pattern, while in general it's still rising. Business cycle, peak, contraction, trough, expansion. So, what's a recession? Well, the answer is the traditional definition of a recession is a decline in real GDP for at least 2 consecutive quarters. 2 quarters of the year, that's half a year, that's 6 months. So in the past, we would always say that if real GDP went down for at least 6 months, that was a recession. In the modern world, we've decided that we can look at a whole bunch more things than that, and we can decide that things shorter than 6 months are recessions. I suppose we could decide that something longer than 6 months isn't. Never done that, but we have picked some things that are shorter than 6 months and said that they are recessions. So traditional definition, real GDP has to go down for 6 months. That's a recession. More complicated modern definition, which is the judgment of a bunch of guys who get to decide. Okay.